You are listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with Steve Worsley, the toxic mold expert and your number one source for mold consulting and mitigation in the USA. Let's dive into a brand new episode. Before we get started on this episode, here's a not so short disclaimer. While all attempts have been made to verify the content provided in this podcast, neither the podcaster or the producers assume any responsibility for errors, omissions, or alternative interpretations of the issues discussed here. All information stated in this podcast is the opinion of Steve Worsley. Steve Worsley is a mold specialist with over 25 years of experience in the construction and mold industry. The Toxic Mold Podcast is for information sharing purposes only. The views expressed are those of the podcaster and his alone. These views should not be taken as expert instruction or commands. While there may be references to medical conditions and symptoms, all podcast episodes are the opinion of Steve Worsley, and any medical questions or concerns shall be addressed with the appropriate licensed medical professional or professionals. As the podcaster refers to different mold types, please be aware that Steve Worsley is not a microbiologist, and questions concerning mold specifics should be answered by the appropriate professional. Steve isn't, nor does he offer any legal advice. For any legal advice, you must speak with a lawyer. The listener is 100% responsible for his or her own actions. You can check out Steve's books on Amazon. Just go to Amazon and search for author Steve Worsley. You can also take Steve's courses on Udemy or Skillshare, and you can find out more about those at cnccontractorservices.com. Now, let's get to the episode.
Hello, you're listening to the Toxic Mold Podcast with myself, Steve Worsley, and my wife, Cassandra. It's almost the end of August, so hopefully this heat's starting to go away, huh?
I hope so. Time flies. This year has gone by so fast.
Yeah, it's kind of the story of our lives, isn't it?
It is.
Just a few years ago, it seemed like we were in our 20s and 30s, and now that's a long ways away.
Yes, that is. Yeah, we're at midlife now.
Anyhow, so today's topic is an interesting one, and it's, do molds always release mycotoxins?
And this is a question you see pop up a lot.
All the time. It's one of the most common questions I get is how do I know if mold is making me sick?
And didn't you give me the analogy of a snake?
Yeah, for mycotoxins.
Yeah.
So let's explain first and foremost what mycotoxins are. So a mycotoxin is the secondary byproduct of a toxigenic mold, meaning it's something that a toxic mold creates, and then it releases those mycotoxins.
And maybe we go back a little bit further, because you talked about the 3 mold types in your book, The Mold Epidemic.
Yes. So there are 3 different mold types or classifications: allergenic, pathogenic, and toxigenic.
Okay.
So when we talk about mold, for our listeners, those that have had just what I call traditional mold testing. What I mean by traditional is just non-viable testing, meaning something we do as professionals, turnaround times really quick. We use, traditional testing could be an air test, a tape lift, a swab, or a bulk sample. Bulk sample, for our listeners, is literally I cut out a piece of building material. Let's just say it's a piece of sheetrock. I cut a little piece out. I put it in a Ziploc bag. I send that directly to the lab. Anyhow, the lab just looks at it under a microscope. It's fairly quick, fairly simple process. It's the cheapest type of testing, and they can only report to us what the mold type is. Meaning, you have a mold type and a mold species. The mold type would be if we're going to talk about snakes. Snakes are in the reptile family. Once you have snakes, there's a bunch of snakes. Some are not venomous, some are. The mold type is similar to the whole snake family.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
So they're only going to report Claudosporium, Penicillium. What's interesting, speaking of traditional mold testing, those that have had it done and they're listening, this is hopefully a learning thing for you. If you look at your report, it'll say ASP /PEN. That's aspen. What that means is Aspergillus or Penicillium. The reason that they're classified together is not because they're the same mold type. It's because they're so similar in a direct examination. So you got to remember, the lab's only looking at this underneath the microscope. They're not waiting for the mold spores to actually become viable, which you'd have to do in a petri dish. They're looking at it under a microscope, and Aspergillus and Penicillium look enough alike that they can't differentiate between the two.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
So to kind of explain that a little bit, traditional mold testing is only going to give us the mold type. So for our listeners, that's like saying a snake or a human. You know, when you have a snake, like I said, is it toxic? Is it going to kill you, or is it not? It's the same thing. So when we do traditional testing, it's very difficult for us to know if it's a toxic mold, which brings us back to that question, is it making me sick?
Okay. So really it's like the allergenic and pathogenic molds are like garden snakes. They're not venomous for
Exactly.
mycotoxins.
Yes.
But it is the toxigenic molds that have the ability to have venom like a snake, which are the mycotoxins.
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. And another analogy I like to use is a porcupine. So a porcupine has its quills. Once it obviously releases that quill, it's a totally separate thing from the porcupine.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that quill can go anywhere in the forest or area that the porcupine is. So the reason I say that is, for our listeners, a toxigenic mold is going to create and release the mycotoxin. Once that mycotoxin is released, it can be anywhere in the home because it's very lightweight.
Okay, so do all toxigenic molds release mycotoxins?
As far as if it's produced it?
Yeah, because I think of a porcupine only releases its quills if it feels it's in danger. It's a defense mechanism.
Yes.
So do toxigenic molds just sit around and throw out mycotoxins? Like they just like they poop them out?
Well, so to kind of backtrack, the reason why I wasn't quite sure how you were asking it, just because it's a toxic mold does not mean for sure that it has created the mycotoxin and released it. It can actually just not have created it yet. Maybe the mold colony hasn't even created mycotoxins. I don't know. That's microbiology stuff that I have no idea about. Once it produces it, we don't even know for sure if it has released it. So to answer your question, once it's produced, does it always release it? We don't know. But what we think we know is it does release it when it feels threatened.
So all toxigenic molds have the capability
Yes.
of releasing mycotoxins.
Producing and releasing,
but we still don't fully understand the biology of it enough.
I don't.
To know, and I think we looked at the research, they don't even know. Microbiologists don't even know for sure.
Right.
Yet, like, under what conditions.
Yeah, because the mycotoxins and the molds won't talk to us.
Yeah, basically. But a lot of the research has said that what their hypothesis, which isn't proven, their hypothesis is that toxigenic molds that do end up releasing mycotoxins are doing so as a defense mechanism.
Exactly. And, we've talked about this before, but it's no different than beans.
The lectins.
Yep. That's why it gives you gas. The beans are trying to survive, just like the mold is. And it brings up a subject that our listeners hear us talk about all the time. This is why it's never a good idea. If you find a mold colony, let's say even if it's in your crawl space or your attic, you don't think it's really in the living area, you never just go spray it. Because in my opinion, and once again, it's only an opinion, if it's a toxigenic mold, it is for sure going to release the mycotoxins.
It's like trying to swat a bee or a wasp and you not killing them.
Yeah.
You better watch out.
Exactly.
It's coming for you.
And if, for that analogy, if you're going to do it in a small room and you're trapped in there, you'd be careful doing that.
Yep.
You got to make sure that you're getting rid of it. And when we're talking about a mold colony, the way you got to get rid of it is with proper containments, PPE, negative air pressure, HEPA vacuums. So, it's a good subject to bring up because in my opinion, if you see a mold colony, we don't really care what kind of mold it is, whether it's toxigenic or not.
No.
We're going to treat, and this kind of brings us back to spending a bunch of money on testing. I don't believe it's necessary to spend a lot of money. Now, I do believe it's necessary to do enough testing before remediation to have a baseline. But the reason I don't think it's necessary to do a whole bunch, I'm going to speak for CNC Contractor Services. We do not base our remediation protocols based on the mold types that are there. And for our listeners, they're probably like, wow, seriously? Well, no, in my opinion, it's a cut that needs to be stitched. So we're going to stitch it. We don't really care. Now, if it's internal bleeding, stuff like that, that's obviously way more complex. But my point is you should always treat every mold infestation in your home as if it is toxigenic.
Well, but the reasoning is pretty clear. You also talk about in your books that the three things that mold needs to grow. The reason why you're saying you always cut no matter what the type of mold it is that if that part of the sheetrock, the wall, the subfloor allows any mold to grow, it certainly will feed toxigenic mold.
Exactly.
So you remove those water damaged parts because it is food for all kinds of molds.
Right. Yeah. And, for the most part, the toxigenic molds, that's what they have to, that's the type of molds that need to thrive to do. Because, you got to realize it this way. And a lot of people probably know this, but we don't talk about it this way. The whole purpose of mold is to destroy whatever organism it's eating. It's getting rid of it.
Yes. It's like what are they?
Like a parasite.
A skin eating. Wasn't there once a skin eating sort of thing that was eating skin eating parasite or bug? There's some kind of illness. Maybe that's
like
what
leprosy.
Maybe that's what leprosy is. I don't know.
Yeah, that's way beyond.
Yeah, but the whole point is that it consumes the area it can thrive in.
Exactly.
It doesn't just lop onto a subfloor or a piece of sheetrock and stay the same. That's its food. It grows.
Exactly. And, once again, that's why, and I know we talked about it last week, this is why we do inspections before we do remediation. This is not every company's going to do this. So for our listeners that have dealt with remediation, they're like, wow, they didn't even do an inspection. The reason I do the inspection before we do remediation, we will not, CNC Contractor Services will not do remediation until you or us as the company, when I say you as the homeowner, have identified and fixed the defect that led to the mold infestations. No. Meaning, if it was a leaking roof, we're not going...
No, because it's just going to come again.
Exactly.
So I think this is something that a lot of people ask because there are lots of people who get that mold is a big issue, but mycotoxin is a relatively new term to a lot of people. And I think the more people learn about mycotoxins from things like the mycotoxin prevention kit, the more they're starting to go into hiring an IEP and saying to themselves, well, obviously, if you're going to come test for mold, you're going to test for mycotoxins, right? Can you talk about the difference between the two and why mycotoxin testing is multi-pronged, because there's medical and then there's home, but why IEPs don't necessarily, if they're coming to do mold testing, that's not a given that they're doing mycotoxin testing, right?
That's correct. So, and it's a great subject to bring up. For our listeners, if you're hiring an IEP, you want to ask them about mycotoxins and just ask them, how do you test for mycotoxins? If they don't know what you're talking about, you need to hire somebody else.
Yep.
Now, to backtrack just a little bit, traditional mold testing that we talked about, air testing, tape lift, swabs, bulk sampling, that is just non-viable testing. It's quick turnaround time. That is not mycotoxin testing. That is traditional mold testing's the cheapest for a reason. It's easy to do. Lab fees are very low. When we jump into mycotoxin testing, there are several different labs. There's several different methods. We, as far as CNC Contractor Services, we can do mycotoxin testing with Hayes Microbial. We can do it with Respirair. I don't have the equipment yet for Respirair to do their mycotoxin testing, but it's an air test. Hayes Microbial is a swab, like the ERMI, and Real-Time Labs, which is the EMA test. Those tests, just the test itself, is a minimum $350 to $400 just for our lab fees. So my point is it's much more expensive. Now, to do the mycotoxin testing, for our listeners, you have to be clear with your IEP that that's what you want done. And some IEPs just don't even know what it is.
Well, and there's a difference between, just because you're testing mycotoxins in the home doesn't mean that you don't have to test mycotoxins in your body on the medical side, right?
Exactly.
Okay.
So, and once again, this is why mold is so complex. You know, I'm dealing with a client right now where we're seeing some concerns in testing. We see a few red flags. We know one area that needs remediation, but we're still kind of not getting the answers we want without more testing. And we have already done mycotoxin testing. It's in a home that is cleaned very, very well. It was difficult to find enough dust. Well, what happens is from the IEP's side of things, so my side of things, we're looking at certain things and we do want to make sure that it is the mycotoxins that's making the people sick. That's when I get into the referring them, to a Dr. Diane or Dr. Fox, or to hire a health coach like Heather. Like, we want to get the medical side involved. And so to answer your question, a lot of times we do need that side of things just to put the piece of the puzzle or to finish the puzzle. Did I answer your question?
You did. And I think it's worth saying, just, as somebody who really focuses on health data and the importance of health data in my own care, I think it's important to have medical baselines for everything.
Right.
So doing the medical mycotoxin testing in advance of any mycotoxin deep cleaning or whatever, or mitigation, is helpful because you need to know where you started health-wise, which means working with somebody like Heather, Dr. Fox, find your medical team. So you get your data to start, and then over time you can track the changes in the data later.
Yeah. And I want to be clear for our listeners, just because you go out and get a medical mycotoxin test, there's urine testing, there's blood serum, there's real-time labs, which is who we use for the environmental mycotoxins. There's Vibrant Wellness, which is a urine test. Real-time labs is a urine test. My Myco Lab is a blood serum. There's Mosaic, which used to be Great Plains. There's Sunrise Labs. There's tons of labs out there that do medical mycotoxin testing. It's very important, first and foremost, to be working with a mold-literate doctor.
Yep.
And it's also very important to have the proper testing, which, once again, our listeners know this. We've interviewed 2 doctors and a health coach. That's the health side of things I stay out of. But what I want to be clear with our listeners is it's important that you get the proper test done, and don't just take that mycotoxin medical test and assume you have mycotoxins in your home, because it could be from previous exposure.
That's true.
There's people like Heather that it was actually from childhood.
Yep.
And my point is to our listeners, don't just go get a medical test, just get the cheapest one you can get and then assume you have mycotoxins in your home. That's not always how it works.
That's very, very true. But I think it's important to understand that it's not enough even on the medical side to just do the medical mycotoxin testing. When you work with a health coach and you work with doctors who are mold literate, they may ask you to do a number of other tests to put all the full picture together. But that is good to know, so that when you work with an IEP and you say, hey, I've had these things happen medically on the mycotoxin side, I'm wondering if my home has mycotoxins. That's sort of a way to test your home to sort of rule out, is the home a concern or do I need to look somewhere else?
Yes, because once again, like when you have the medical side, we don't know for sure if it's your home.
Correct.
And even though maybe you just started showing symptoms, it could have been something that's an underlying condition that for years and years and years hasn't showed itself, and then all of a sudden you're seeing it. Don't just assume that it's in your home. Because on the other hand, it could be, maybe you go to your mother's home or children or grandparents or anybody's home. There could be mycotoxins there. The mycotoxins could be at work. They could be at school. There's many places where you could be exposed to the mycotoxins, or it could have happened earlier, years ago. So that's why it's important when you're putting the puzzle together to do mycotoxin testing in the home.
Absolutely. So going full circle back to the question, do molds always release mycotoxins? What's your answer to that?
No. I mean, once again, we have to determine if it's a toxic mold. Now, if it is a toxic mold species, then yes. I mean,
it has the ability.
Exactly. I would just assume because the toxic mold is there that it has produced and released mycotoxins.
And so what does somebody do if they do mold testing and they know that there's Stachybotrys or some other toxigenic mold present in their home? Should they jump right to getting mycotoxin testing done?
That's kind of a tricky question just because we don't know the whole context of everything. Once again, if you're a listener and you see Stachybotrys, Chaetomium, common mold types like Aspergillus and Penicillium can produce toxigenic mold species. So don't just assume because it's a common mold that it's not toxic. But if you know and you're a listener and you're like, okay, so we had air testing done. Here's what it showed for Stachybotrys. We know there's an issue. If the Stachybotrys number is really low, we can maybe go, well, we don't know for sure, where that came from. If the Stachybotrys number is high and the client or our listener knows there's a mold problem in their home, in my opinion, I would get enough baseline testing done and then I would jump to remediation. But I guess to answer your question, you should get an IEP involved that understands everything.
Oh, absolutely. And what do you say to people who listen to this and they go, oh, I know that I've done mold testing and I know that they're toxigenic molds, so there got to be mycotoxins. So I'm just going to call a carpet cleaning company and have them do a deep clean of my house and that should get at it. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. I mean, that would be like asking your GP to perform, a knee replacement. And for the GPs listening, I'm not being degrading, but the carpet cleaning company, even if they're somewhat mold literate, I think it would be very risky because here's the problem. Let's say for some reason you have toxic mold colonies in the home, produced, released mycotoxins. Those mycotoxins can be in the carpet. And depending on the type of carpet cleaning they do, because there's all sorts of different ways to clean carpets, there's getting it wet and shampooing it and all that stuff. My point is they could be kicking up the mycotoxins and they could actually make things worse.
And spread them further through the house.
Yep. And, if there's a mold issue in the, let's just say, the subfloor below those carpets, you have them. If it's in the subfloor, it's probably in the carpet pad and it's in the carpet. You're actually just making it that much worse.
Absolutely. And if the hypothesis is true, obviously microbiologists don't know this yet. If the hypothesis that toxigenic mold under threat produces mycotoxins, and you bring in somebody to deep clean who doesn't know what they're doing, and they don't really get at the whole issue anyway, now that mold colony feels more at threat. So they're just going to throw them out. Lots of mycotoxins.
And it's done. I doubt your carpet cleaning company is establishing containments. Like the small particle cleaning, it sounds like it's just a deep clean of the house. Well, that is part of it, but it should be done properly. And in my opinion, with negative air or containments or whatnot. So calling a carpet cleaning company could make things much worse.
Absolutely. So what's your call to action for people?
If you kind of just addressed it, if you know that you're sick, let's say you did the medical mycotoxin testing, you've been sick, it's showing up in your medical test. If you know you have a visible mold concern, get a professional in there and have it addressed and mitigation taken care of. Don't waste your time wondering if, it's toxic mold or not. If you can see mold growing somewhere, have it removed and obviously have it done properly.
And I would also say, if you are listening to this and this is the first time you're hearing of mycotoxins, go to cnccontractorservices.com and for, I think it's currently $29, purchase the mycotoxin prevention kit so you can fully educate yourself on this topic. I mean, we covered the highlights on this episode, but this is not a full education.
No.
You will absolutely get a full education in the mycotoxin prevention kit. So I know sometimes people hear new things that could be affecting their health and they start to panic. Rather than panic, education first. Then with the being informed, you can now make new decisions.
Yeah. And it's, in my field, it's something I deal with quite often. People call and they want like remediation done tomorrow. And then when I ask more questions, I try to, in a politically correct way, say like, let's take our time here. Let's not just jump to remediation. Like you said, get educated, do your research, understand what mycotoxins really are. One of these days, I've been working on it forever, updating the mold epidemic to include more about mycotoxins. I have 5 books that are out right now, and we don't really take any deep dives into mycotoxins, but for our listeners, if you want to learn more, especially about mold, I have plenty of books that I'll put the link in the podcast description, but they're all available on Amazon.
And on Audible.
Exactly. They're actually ebook, Audible, paperback, and some are hardback.
That's right.
So, well, I appreciate all you listeners for listening. Have a great week.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Make sure you go to our website at cnccontractorservices.com and sign up for the mold investigation checklist. Again, go to cnccontractorservices.com and get your free mold investigation checklist today. You can also on cnccontractorservices.com find out more about Steve's courses and books and consultations. Once again, go to cnccontractorservices.com.